Luetke. I'm so happy to be with you today. I'm a member of Salmon Bay Meeting, which is in the Seattle area on Duwamish land in the Pacific Northwest yearly meeting. And I've been a member of Salmon Bay for about a decade when I moved out here from the Midwest. I also, for about the last 5 or 6 years, have attended a Pentecostal church, an all-Black church except for me, in the heart of Seattle. And during times of COVID, I have found myself at North Seattle Friends Church, which is a pastoral church. My brother passed away about a year ago April, and I found completely silent worship just very challenging, so I switched over for a bit. I wrote the Kendall Sparrow initially for my children. I have 4 children. They're all adults now. The youngest 2 are deaf. They were all raised Quaker. And I wanted to give them back their history. However, I have widened that journey, and this book was published by FGC Quaker Press and now is being used by other people outside my family. And so I'm happy to share about it today with you. I thought I might begin with perhaps reading a little bit from it, thinking that maybe most of you are not as familiar with it. Let me see if I can get it up here. Nope, I guess not. You'll have to imagine the cover. It's a beautiful painting of Pendle Hill. And Pendle Hill is very significant in this story. As you can imagine, it's the history of the very first Friends, so it takes place primarily in central England. Also wanted to mention the Valiant 60. A lot of people have heard about the Valiant 60, but in case you haven't, they were friends who were led to travel in pairs or small groups in the first days of Quakerism to populated areas and preach. And we owe a lot to them. They are primarily, I believe, the reason that Quakerism lasted and kind of rose above all these other faith practices that were popping up at the time. So in this reading from chapter 8, there is Lizzie Levens. There's a lot of real people in this novel, and 20 of them are listed at the back of the book, the ones that are under 30 years of age. Like Occupy and Black Lives Matter and the North Dakota Pipeline, Quakerism had a lot of leadership from young adult friends, and Lizzie and Elizabeth and Thomas were all part of that. So Elizabeth Levens lives across the street from Elizabeth Fletcher, across the lane. And because they were both really named Elizabeth, I call Lizzie Lizzie to keep her straight from Elizabeth. There's a little girl, Mo, who Elizabeth befriends, and Mo is deaf. And then Edward Burroughs, he was a real person. He was 22 when he first met George Fox and was just an amazing preacher. He, like Elizabeth, Lizzie, Thomas, died before he was 30 because of because he was imprisoned and became very ill. Then there's Elizabeth and Hannah, Lizzie's parents. They're totally fabricated. Thomas Home was a real person, went on to be one of the Valiant 60 and later married Lizzie. In my book, I say that I concoct that they were married, the first to be married in the manner of friends, but I don't really know that. It's just that it was early on, so it was probably the case. So chapter 8, Lizzie found Elizabeth in the cow barn with Mo, finishing the evening chores. "George Fox, he's come, he's here," she cried. swiping at the smoke released by the hissing oil lamp. She purposely went closer to the smelly thing so Mo could see her gestures. Come, she signed, widely arcing an arm and then pointing across the lane in the direction of her cottage. There, fetch Auntie and come over. Moments later, Elizabeth, Auntie, and Mo arrived at the Levins' front room. The space transformed. Gone were the muddy footprints and spinning wheel. The bundle of hanging herbs had all been moved to the back corner and the family chairs pushed together, a bench added. Beeswax candles were set about, giving off a magic cast the color of egg yolk and marking the evening as a special occasion. Mo dropped Elizabeth's hand and went, baby doll in tow, to the beautiful vase of forget-me-nots, larkspur, and daisies that sat on the small, low table in the corner of the room, in the center of the room. Edward was talking to a stranger, a rotund older gentleman who stood out among the country people in his fancy waistcoat, the ribbons of his loose trousers tied evenly at the knees. He couldn't be the preacher, could he? Elizabeth wondered, her eyes fixed on his polished boots. She flitted to Kelsey and Hannah, serving beer and making small talk, and then shifted her gaze again. Her breath caught. George Fox, she was sure of it. He'd come from the back room and was standing beside Edward. Not much older than Thomas, but younger than Kelsey. He was clean shaven and his cheeks were bright from braving the wind. Whereas Charles and Thomas were dressed as men in the trades, the sleeveless leather jerkin and dark breeches of the preacher were plain, and his shirt was soiled. There was a tear down the side of one of his stockings, and there were no buckles on his shoes. Auntie tapped Elizabeth's shoulder. Stop staring, she scolded gently. She pointed to a couple of chairs, and they sat down, just as Mo returned. Doll dangling in her grasp, she raised both hands up like a toddler might to sit on Elizabeth's lap. Then, settled there, she squirmed side to side a couple of times and purposely crossed her arms across the front of her little shift, as if she were hugging herself. When Elizabeth smiled at her, she repeated the movements. Love, Elizabeth guessed, dipping her chin to meet Mo's gaze. Love, yes, she signed. The room seemed filled with it. She opened her heart to the possibilities of the evening, pulling Mo into her chest and resting her chin on the top of her little head. I'm wondering, since we're Audrey,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I have a question. I'm just wondering how this is being done, because should we just ask questions at any point? Or Lois, are there questions that you're already planning to ask, or Barb, you already, sorry, because I'm a visitor on this. So
no,
I'm just
it's
not
okay,
sure
Audrey. You're more than
anything.
welcome here. I sent Barbara a list of questions. I know that Susanna was particularly interested in George Fox's visit to the United States. So if you'd like to start with that one, that would be great.
Sure. And if friends have reflections or questions along the way, we concocted some questions just to fill the space. And from doing these book sharings, I have a good feeling for what friends usually want to know. But I'm happy to talk about anything else, including when George Fox came to the United States, which of course wasn't the United States then, it was the colonies. And he first came by way of Barbados in about 1655, I think. I'm actually researching right now a second novel that takes place in the next century. So this book takes place in the 17th century. My novel about migration from Pennsylvania to North Carolina out to Ohio and Indiana will be in the 18th century, but there's a reminiscing about when George Fox comes to the colonies. So he came to Barbados and then to North Carolina. And he went on to, and he stayed in Barbados about 3 months with an in-law, with a relative, and really didn't say too much about slavery there. So people kind of make a big deal about that in writings. And then he went on to New England, and he was traveling with Edward Burroughs, who is a pretty important character in the second half of the Kendall Sparrow. William Edmondson, I meant to say, if that's not what I said. He came with William Edmondson, who heard George Fox preach and took Quakerism to Ireland. And so, you know, a few years later, he traveled with George Fox to North Carolina, and it's William Edmondson who went inland and met with North Carolina friends, which is kind of the history behind my second novel. What George Fox did after he went north to New England, I don't really know.
He went to Flushing, and he gave a talk at Flushing meeting. Thomas Edmondson, that's very interesting, because my ancestors followed Thomas Edmondson to Ireland, to Lurgan. So that's fascinating.
Isn't
wow.
it?
So he was in the United States. God.
Yeah. His first name, I think I might have misspoke. His first name was actually William Edmondson.
Whatever it was, but he'd been a soldier, I believe.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
As were many of the first friends, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Audrey.
Yeah. Barbara, I know you traveled a lot in writing this book, you know, the research. Can you tell us a bit about your travels to write the book?
Sure. I was lucky enough to get 2 grants that assisted me in my research. I'd be happy to talk about them if any of you are looking for monetary support from friends to do work that you're led to do. One was called the Lyman Fund, and I was able to use that money primarily to travel for going to, I actually did Elizabeth Fletcher's route backwards. She was last in Ireland. I went to Ireland first. And then I was able to use I was able to go to Woodbrook in central England for 6 weeks and study there as an Eva Cox scholar. That was a great opportunity as well. So I traveled to, well, I'm gonna do it just not to be confusing. I'm gonna actually tell you where I was in the order that Elizabeth was there. So Elizabeth was born in Kendall, as was Lizzie and Thomas, and she walked about 250 miles with Lizzie Levens, she really did, to Oxford. And I was able to go to Oxford, and I stayed with friends in all these places, friends who didn't know me, but offered that hospitality that we're known for. And a friend there took me totally down the route she would have walked in Oxford, where she was beat up, where she was arrested. It was just a really meaningful day, and I did a book sharing there. I was able to go up to Kendall twice. The first was a couple of years before I started my book. I went on a pilgrimage to what was called a pilgrimage to George Fox country. And it was all around the Lake District area where Pendle Hill is. And, you know, some of these really important things happened when George Fox was starting out. Later in her life, after Oxford, Elizabeth went to Dublin to preach. I was able to go to the church that she preached in and stand where she stood. Ooh, I get choked up even today thinking about this. And she was arrested there and is recorded as spending time in jail in Dublin. And then later she went to Cork. She was the first to preach in Cork. And I was able to go there. So be mindful, she was like 15. 17 years old. The book ends when she's 19. So she was young, and Lizzie and Thomas were young as well. So we owe a lot to these young friends.
Wow.
And I hope if you read the book,
Wait,
Kendall,
I think Tom had his hand up. I don't know if you saw that.
okay, I just
Yeah,
wanted to
I was still on mute. What were you able to use as sources because you so authentically filled in the times and the mood and the tenor of politics? What did you use as sources for history?
Well, before
Right.
I was able to travel, before I found travel funds, and this is right where I am with my second novel too, just looking for funding, I used the internet. Like if I sat down to talk about them eating, and I'd think to myself, gee, I wonder if they had forks. And so I, do an internet search, like what was in a country house in 1652,
Yeah.
And so the internet was really, really helpful. When I was able to be at Woodbrook, which I applied to because they have one of the best Quaker history libraries in the world, I was able to read. Elizabeth either dictated or wrote. She was illiterate initially, so it's unknown whether she wrote a pamphlet or she dictated a pamphlet. But in any case, there's one pamphlet by her. And I, with white gloves and a pillow, was able to watch the librarian unlock shelving, take down the pamphlet, hand it to me, show me how to open it on the pillow and read her pamphlet. That was a pretty exciting day. And then there were several histories that come from letters that primarily from Edward Burroughs, writing back to Margaret Feld in Swarthmore about her. And I tried to use a lot of the exact wording in the letters in the novel, but they're also at the back of the book where there's a biography about her. So we know a little bit about her from those letters. And because of that, I kind of imagined a little bit of fondness between Edward Burroughs and Elizabeth Fletcher. But he clearly was touched by her and her authenticity as a preacher. And then there's a couple histories, early histories of friends where she's talked about, but always in reference to those letters. We wouldn't really know about Elizabeth Fletcher or about 4 or 5 of the other poor women, Quaker preacher women that are mentioned in the novel if something horrible hadn't happened to them. And that is the case with her story. It's also the case with Dorothy Woe, who I mention in the novel, who was bridled, which is this contraption they would put on bold women's heads. I always think, oh, we all know one of those people. But it was this contraption that had this bulb in it that went into your mouth and went through your tongue. And then they would lead these women around to humiliate them. Dorothy Woe wrote about that. And so we know that she was bridled. So by and large, I just was able to read these stories that appeared in letters that people wrote primarily to Margaret Feld.
I see. Yeah.
I come from a university professor background. I love research and writing. And my problem initially in this book, before it really got seasoned, and also now in where I am in my project now, is that I love the research part. I feel fortunate that my characters have become very dear to people, especially Mo. The little deaf girl seems to have found a sweet place in a lot of people's hearts. But they're all, all the description of those characters is all fabricated, and the only dialogue that is authentic is when Elizabeth is brought before the authorities in Oxford, somebody wrote down exactly the questions that were asked of her and what her answers were. And so I have repeated that in the book. But other than that, you know, it's all made up. Audrey.
Yeah, for that actual dialogue, before in the court, where did you find that? Do you know that that existed, or did you stumble on it as you were researching?
Yeah, I stumbled on it. So when I went to England, I had about 120,000 words written, and the book had to be 90,000. So I had, you know, all kinds of stuff that eventually was taken out. And when I got to Woodbrook, what I had to do is what I call unzip what I had, fill in these places where I found new information, and then kind of zip it back up again. And that tale, the tale of Elizabeth Fletcher, the story of Elizabeth Fletcher, like the one I'm working on now, you know, doesn't need much to make it absolutely thrilling. These people went through a lot, and their stories, I'm happy to be able to share their stories because this was about a 4-year project. And I would often sit in meeting on first day and just think, wow, you know, I'm sitting here because of these people, and really enjoyed bringing their stories to light.
I'm curious, how did you first get this leading to research the story of Elizabeth Fletcher?
Well, I lived in Kansas at the time. My family was members of Penn Valley Friends, which is unprogrammed meeting in Kansas City. And our yearly meeting was at Scattergood Friends School, which is in Iowa, about 6 hours away. And so when I would go to yearly meeting, I would go to the library just to, you know, hang out a little bit, read what they had there. And I came upon this book by Jill Skidmore that was just a little kind of half book, pamphlet book about, I think it had maybe 12 women's stories in it. And Elizabeth Fletcher was a page and a half of that book. And I just couldn't get her out of my head. My own children, my oldest girls were like middle school and high school. And I kept thinking, how could her parents let her walk all this way in this dangerous time? Because I knew that people, wasn't it Barclay that had gotten beat up along the way and eventually died from being accosted by robbers? And so, you know, I just couldn't fathom how this had happened. And I just couldn't let it go. And I wrote, under the care of my meeting, I started collecting stories of young friends, remarkable 17th century, remarkable Quaker youth. And I self-published those in a book, which again, oh, there it is. I self-published those under the care of my meeting and illustrated them with stories of contemporary adult young friends, because my girls were going, by that time, my girls were going to FGC gathering. I mean, we all were, but they were in the FGC gathering high school program, and they would come and tell me all these things that their friends were involved with. And so I used those pictures of those friends of my daughters to illustrate the story of these 25 17th century friends. So then, you know, time passed, my kids went to college, I had more time on my hands, and I always wanted to go on this in the footsteps of George Fox pilgrimage. And I'd heard about Max Carter and how he was leading these, but by the time my kids were all gone, Max Carter was not doing it anymore. But I found
Barb, is something blocking your microphone? Is the book maybe blocking your microphone? Because we're having trouble hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, that's good now. Yes.
Oh, sorry. So anyway, I got to go a couple years later after Scattergood. After that reading in Scattergood, I was able to go on one of those pilgrimages, and I would ask people along the way. I don't know if you know Ben Pink Dandelion, but we met him as part of that, and his wife Heidi, or Wendy Hampton. I asked her, like, what about these women? I mean, how could their parents let them go? And I came home from that pilgrimage and I just decided, I really need to, this is a leading. I really need to deal with this. And I just started in, and that's how it happened. I should say, I didn't just start in. I had a clearness committee. I had I had such good support from my meeting. So I was held during all this time that I worked on this project.
I am curious about the process here. When you had your clearness committee meeting, did they ask you questions and help you with your process?
I really believe they did. At the time, like a lot of things that we get involved with, I didn't really know how huge this project would be. And I didn't really know if it would be of good service. I think that's a lot clearer now to me. Not only do I feel like the book has served a more palatable way to provide Quaker history, but I've found this whole group of people through Facebook that have Quaker relatives and want to know about Quaker history. And so, I found some different groups that are interested in some of what the story is. One of the people on my clearness committee stayed with me the whole way. I met with her often. Like I'd say at least once a month for 4 years. She read my chapters. She wrote letters of support for me for these grants that I was trying to get. She just really, I'm sure she never knew when she offered to be on clearness that it would be so involved, but she was just amazing. And I really depended on her. Near the end of my project, a paid editor that I was working with for personal reasons had to drop out of the project, and that left me in kind of a scary place. And my friend Meg, that was on my clearness committee, really stepped up at that point. So not only were they involved initially, but my meeting was really with me on this. They were proud of my work. They mentioned it in 2 state of the meeting reports to annual session. They were strong supporters, and I needed that. I've written a lot of textbooks in my field of deaf education, like about 8, but I had never, except aside from a children's novel, I'd never written fiction. And so I was insecure. I was insecure in the leading, and I was insecure in what the end product would be. So, friends were very, very encouraging and helpful.
So you're saying that your meeting told you pretty much that a book would be your product?
I think I was writing, I was thinking it was going to be a book by the time my clearness committee met with me. I came home from Pendle Hill and that whole Quaker pilgrimage experience, really thinking that I was to write this book. And then I asked for a clearness committee then.
Well, that's kind of neat.
Yeah, I mean, it was more about support, praying for me, holding me in the light as I found my way. And as each thing happened, like I got funding, I got a publisher, I got to go to Woodbrook. I mean, they were as joyous as I was. You know, we were in it together.
When you went to Pendle Hill, was that the one near Philadelphia, or was that the Pendle Hill in England?
It was Pendle Hill in England. It was part of the Fox pilgrimage.
Okay.
And kind of a funny story about that is it was right during, you know, many murders of Black people. And, you know, at the bottom of it, it has a plaque about let your life speak. So I went up there. There was about 12 of us that were on this pilgrimage. And I went up there and yelled out, "Black Lives Matter." And all these people kind of looked up at me, and I was like, well, you know, it says, let your life speak. So I'm going to say something up here. But it was, yeah, all those things about Fox's journey. I mean, I just would really encourage you, if you have the wherewithal and finances, to go see them. I found it very thrilling to be in the meeting houses and to be in the towns and be on Pendle Hill and be at Swarthmore Hall. We stayed overnight in Swarthmore Hall. I mean, that was, you know, I just loved it.
Mignon has raised her hand. Mignon, would you please speak?
Yes, I'm eating lunch. That's why I'm kind of hidden. But anyway, now, Barbara, I'm a docent at Fourth and Arch. So is Carol Cook, who's also here in the group. And so think, what would be some, I also always do point out that women were involved from the beginning with Quakerism in a way that was not always true in other religions. If you were a docent at Fourth and Arch and you had only a minute or two to talk about that and give examples, what would you say?
Can you explain first what Worth and Arch is?
Fourth and Arch, the meeting
Oh,
house.
Fourth and Arch. Oh, sorry. I've been there. I lived in North Carolina for a while. This was during 9/11, and I would go up there to worship and to work at FGC. And I remember they would always call me an outlier. Oh, North Carolina, an outlier. I'm like, okay. Well, I think one of the things that you said was that unlike a lot of other faith practices, women were encouraged to preach, were treated with equality. I'm getting into the equality issue a little deeper in my North Carolina research. I mean, it wasn't as equal, I think, as we all would like to believe, at least in the 18th century. And that's why women's meetings were set up and things like that. But if you only have a few minutes, I think what's important is women were perceived as equal. They were given lots of opportunity. They were supported financially. I like to tell the story of Elizabeth Houghton, yet another Elizabeth, who listened to George Fox when he was 22 and encouraged him in his faith before he really had much practice articulating what Friends were all about. And Elizabeth Houghton is credited by some as being the first preacher other than George Fox. So I like that story because she was older. He was like 22, she was like 55. And I think there's a huge message for us about listening to our youth. And I'm going to have an article about her in the Friends Journal coming up real soon. I don't know. I mean, they just gave me the galleys, so it must be soon. So, you know, just one or two stories about, it wasn't all just Margaret Feld. I mean, there were people, there were young, poor, illiterate Quaker women walking around England spreading our faith. Oh. Elizabeth and Thomas were the first to go to Wales. So, you know, they were on the front lines.
Thank you. Susanna's hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, did you go to Gisborne or Paythorn?
No, where are those places?
Right next, short walk from Pendle Hill. Yeah.
Oh, no, not that I recall. That trip was, 5 or 6 years ago now, but no, not that I recall.
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting because my Dodgson last name, I became interested because my mother's descended from Quakers that ended up in Ireland, and my father's Dodgson ancestors came from Gisborne, and I was wondering if there was some connection, but I haven't found one. Because I mean, how can you? It's very interesting because that whole area of Lancashire, which is sometimes occasionally Yorkshire, it's like on the border. It's very Quaker to this day.
yeah. I love to hear all these stories too. And when I was at Woodbrook, of course, it's a retreat center. So there's lots of people coming through. The 4 of us were there for 6 weeks. I mean, everybody else is there for like 4 days, so
Yeah.
there's people coming through. And everybody's got a story and everybody's curious. And even the research I'm doing now about North Carolina, people are coming from Pennsylvania to people were coming from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. And then before that, they're all from England or Ireland, so it's very interesting to me as well to trace back and take some pride in what these people went through to come and worship, and in North Carolina to move again because of the war and because of slavery issues, and not wanting to fight, to move again. So
Well, in Gisborne, which, as I said, is a short walk from Pendle Hill, Cromwell's men, I'm not sure whether it was Cromwell or the King's men, the Royalists or the Roundheads, but they took over St. Mary's Church in Gisborne, and they actually billeted their soldiers in the church. So I imagine the locals were pretty mad at everyone at the war,
probably, yeah. Well, you say you've done some research, Susanna, so you probably know a lot about this, but there is a lot of articles, scholarly work on the internet or available through libraries where a lot of people have really gotten into this, and especially, again, family history people, because they're interested in digging up their roots and finding out about their Quaker relatives. And so, if you haven't searched around, like WikiTree, for example, I have found an incredible amount of information by just putting in the names and kind of seeing what comes up. And a lot of it is the relatives, but then below that, there's, lots of times articles and references to other articles that give background.
Yeah, but yeah, right.
Yeah, I can tell you've done your homework.
Well, I'm actually more interested in finding out when we came from Africa. But we did, but I haven't been able to link that back. When I can find out when we walked from the savannah across to Europe, that's when I'll feel I'm done, because we all came from Africa.
Audrey has had her hand up, so
I'm
Audrey,
sorry. Thank you for calling those out. I can't always see those hands, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. Margaret Fell appears in your book, and of course she was a real person. And I feel like there's a little bit of a renewed interest in her writings. But I'm wondering, when you were researching for your book, like, how much did you get into Margaret Fell's writings? And were there any other early Quaker women who wrote anywhere near what she did?
I did not get into a lot of Margaret Fell. I read some things where, mostly she was important because she was in charge of what was called the Kendall Fund, and the Kendall Fund gave like shoes to Lizzie and those kinds of things. So it was fun to read down the Kendall Fund pages and see where these they weren't characters, they were people, were actually funded by the Kendall Fund, which was largely her money. as I understand it. So, you know, I was involved a little bit there. And of course I have, I mean, how can you write about First Friends without including Swarthmore Hall? So I do have a couple chapters where Elizabeth's at Swarthmore Hall, and it enabled me to give a great contrast to how Margaret Fell lived at Swarthmore Hall and how these people lived out in this rural area of Kendall. So I was able to do some nice contrasting there, and read about like what, and I was at the house, her home, Margaret Fell's home. I stayed there. So I knew a lot of, I'd seen the Bible and I knew a lot of what it looked like. But I didn't really, you know, I was only there for what seemed like a very short time. And I get up at 4 to write, and I would work all day. And I felt so overwhelmed by just what I needed to get through that I kind of kept it real focused.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's good.
And then as far as other people, most of the people that are in my book, the Woe sisters and Lizzie, they were really poor and illiterate. Mary Fisher, I had to get Mary Fisher's story in there because it's so remarkable. You know, so they weren't writing. It was the men who were able to read and write, and
Right.
luckily some of them wrote about the women, you know. And again, like I said, they only wrote about them because horrible things happened to them.
Yeah.
So I had to depend on a lot of the men's writing to really get into like what their language was like and what that inner convincement felt like. And most people didn't even really write about it. I was really hungry to read about, well, what like internally happened when you became convinced, you know. As it ended up, I had to conjure up a lot of that from my own experiences. So I wasn't able to read much of the women of the time because they weren't the people that were writing.
Yeah, that's a shame.
Susanna has a question.
Yeah, first of all, I really think it's terrific that you're writing fiction. I'm very interested in women's fiction. And I've been a part of Quaker communities now for 30 years. And I keep seeing that women's fiction books keep getting thrown out, discarded. And that really upsets me. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on women? See, the thing was that men were, I mean, this is why Jane Austen wrote books, because she wasn't allowed to write history. So she wrote fiction, which is, of course, women's history. So I think the women's fiction books are tremendously important.
Well, I serve on the FGC Publication and Distribution Committee. And so my first thing that springs to mind is we are a small group. We have few publishers that are interested in publishing what Quaker authors have to offer. And fiction isn't what sells. Fiction isn't the top. The fiction books are not the top seller at FGC Quaker Press, which Audrey could speak to better than I. But I'm just, man, you should have seen me jumping around my 2 small rooms here when I found out they were going to publish my book. I mean, it was just thrilling. And I've tried to help promote women's fiction in my book, because I'm so grateful that it was published. So, I mean, that's kind of what springs to my mind. I was very important to me to tell the stories of these lost Quaker women in my book, and to try to weave them in a plausible way, which I think I succeeded in doing, because I don't want those stories lost. And it's hard to find the stories of these first women.
Well, I would like to see previous books republished. I mean, the copyright is clearly over. Jessamine Wright, who was a first cousin of Richard Nixon, she wrote fantastic fiction. And I've seen these books discarded. I mean, I was volunteering at PYM Library for a while, and it just broke my heart. It's like no one wants to read that. Well, that's, you don't want to read things you don't know about, I mean, essentially that's like censorship. So I'm very interested in these old books coming back, because I can remember so many of them, and they were just thrown out from the libraries that I was around. Some of them I've managed to rescue, but not nearly enough.
Well,
So I think there probably are a lot of Quaker women's fiction books that exist, and maybe they're in Swarthmore Library or Woodbrook or wherever, Pendle Hill. Maybe we can find them. But I would really encourage anyone who's interested in this to republish these books and market them. I mean, I can market them. I have 5 websites. Occasionally people read them, read my websites and my social media. Yeah. So, but I think it's great what you're doing, because
well, thank you.
you're shining a light on women's fiction, which is really important. Thank you.
Well, I have to say,
I-
this whole thing about charity right that I'm working on now, I mean, it's amazing. This woman is not only part of the migration of Pennsylvania to North Carolina to what was the West then, Indiana and Ohio, but during a time when friends were trying for 100 years to decide what they were going to do about slavery, during wartime. I mean, there's so much going on. And it's just such interesting reading. But again, I just want to say what I'm hoping from my work is that it gives friends who don't know our history a way to enjoy reading about our history. I mean, I really think that if somebody read the Kendall Sparrow, they would know more about the history of Quakers than almost anybody in meeting.
Right.
Because we just don't, a lot of people just don't know about it. I when I do these talks, I mean, I find out a lot that people don't know about Pendle Hill or what Swarthmore Hall is or Margaret Feld, let alone, some of these other secondary characters. And I'm not judging that. I'm just saying, boy, I'd love to put a book in their hands so that they can know what a gift it is that these people gave us.
Yeah.
Audrey, did you want to say something?
I thought Carol had her hand up. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I just had a very short question. What is the recommended age range for your book?
There's one person in my meeting in junior high that's read it. But I think high school, adult young friend, and then adults. The reading, the vocabulary, I mean, I come out of a special ed background, so the vocabulary is not real highfalutin or anything. And I think the storyline, it just goes linearly. It doesn't have like flashbacks or anything like that. It's pretty straightforward plot. So I would love to get it in the hands of adult young friends. I always envisioned this to be used in Quaker study and Quaker history classes at the high school and college level, and I have not been able to break through on those, in that area. But like I said, I wrote this book to give my own children their history back. I mean, Hannah, my second daughter, was in 7th grade, and we lived in the Kansas City area at the time, and they were studying Pennsylvania, and her teacher told her the Quakers were all dead. And here's a kid who was going to meeting every first day. So I wanted them to know their history, and my children were already very much activists. And I wanted them to know that the first friends were very much activists as well. So thank you for asking that, Carol. I hope this book will be spread among especially high school and college age people.
Thanks.
Audrey.
I was going to say, I don't think I'd recommend it for an earlier age, just because, the descriptions of assaults are not for younger readers.
Yeah. I mean, what happened to Elizabeth? Elizabeth, a lot of people think that Elizabeth died from her injuries. And that's written about quite a bit. I kind of leave that up in the air, because after she was beaten up, she went to Ireland for like at least 2 years. So I've kind of thought a lot about what might have happened to her, but yeah, she was assaulted, and like I said, Dorothy Wool was bridled. I mean, these were not good things. But so that's true. There are some scenes that are pretty graphic, but not too graphic.
Now, I would think any audience that could read Anne Frank's diary could read your book.
Oh, I appreciate that.
No, no.
Well, you can read it and decide who you want to give it to. Michael and Mary Ann and Bill. Yeah, there's Bill's hand. I'm curious about why you're here today and if there's anything you're interested in. Bill, go ahead.
Member of this meeting for a long time now, since about 1980.
Can't hear you.
But anyhow, what I really had a question about the North Carolina connection, and it comes about because for a period of time, for a year, my wife was working in Washington, D.C., and we lived in Alexandria, Virginia. She went down to Williamsburg for one visit, and we learned about what was going on with Quakers in Williamsburg. And I was just wondering what sort of connection there was between Pennsylvania and places.
I'm not the person to answer that. I'm new in my project, and I'm really focusing on the Greensboro area, which is where Charity Wright Cook was in that area, Cane Creek meeting. And I'll be going there at the end of May to visit, but in the North Carolina area. I also had thought about going to Williamsburg, but funding is lacking. And so I'm just gonna stay in Greensboro, but I'm sorry, I can't help you there. But again, I bet you there's stuff online about it.
Boones and whatnot who were, active in Quakerism and various things during that time. But it was basically it was a day just talking to people and hearing about what went on in Williamsburg with respect to there.
Yeah, Bill, you're pretty far from where your microphone is, so you're hard to hear. But have I not answered your question sufficiently?
I mean, you basically said that you're not, that's something you can't really address.
Yeah. I mean, there were people, the basic story is there were people that had come from England, come into Pennsylvania, didn't want to go farther west in Pennsylvania because of Native American issues, and so went south, and they went into Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina. And then, like I said, and they farmed and had these huge Quaker settlements. And then, like I said, because of slavery issues and the Revolutionary War and French Indian War, they decided to just pick up and go west, which was Idaho and, I mean, not Idaho, excuse me, Ohio and Indiana. So they could just not have to deal with all these issues that were against their faith. I mean, people were dropping out of Quakers because they were marrying outside the faith, and a lot of them were fighting in the wars, and so they got read out, and so people just moved. So that's a lot of people moved. So that's kind of the gist of it. But what exactly happened in Williamsburg, I don't know.
Yeah.
So Michael, Mary Ann, I'm curious. Like,
hi, yeah, I enjoyed your talk a lot. I'm just always happy to learn more about Quaker history and the women's movement and equal rights for women and stuff. So, I'm just curious to hear it. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
well, thank you. The story of Charity Wright Cook is even more interesting along those lines, because she was raped as a 15-year-old and yet disowned by meeting because they claim she didn't do enough about it. So it kind of speaks of the Me Too movement.
Oh yeah.
And it's dicey to get into, but I think it's going to be a really great project. I'm working with a man, doctoral student in North Carolina who's really gotten into this too. And he's the one who's going to take me around when I go there. And, you know, there's just a lot of really interesting issues, women's issues that are going to come about from the telling of her story. So
Yeah.
thanks
Yeah,
for your interest.
Real good. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Marianne, we're happy to have you today.
Hi, I just unmuted myself. I've heard of your book. When Lois told us that you would be presenting today, and I have not had a chance to acquire it because I've been doing some traveling. I'm out in California right now, but I certainly have every intention of acquiring it and reading it. It sounds even more interesting than I expected.
Oh, good.
You've made an excellent presentation about it that's piqued my interest. So
Great.
I'll be getting it, and I actually look forward to more that you'll be writing.
Oh, good. Well, you can get it through FGC Press, of course, because they,
Right, yeah.
FGC Books, because they published it. So
I know, I actually looked it up during our lunch break after our meeting, and before we started, I looked up to see where I'd get it. So.
along those lines, those of you who have read the book or will be reading it, I would love for you to go on Amazon and Goodreads and rate it. You don't have to take the time to write a review. You can just hit the number of stars you would give it. And that is surprisingly helpful when I apply for grants or when I'm talking to other people. It's a lot of people are familiar with Goodreads, and they use that star system as a way of deciding what fiction they're going to read or what books they're going to read. So
Right.
Please keep that in mind.
Definitely. I know Goodreads, you can rate through Kindle, but I looked for your book on Amazon and it was not there. That was the first place I looked during lunch break. It was not on Amazon.
Well, luckily it's hard to find because of course we want people to buy it from FGC Quaker Books, but in order to get it on Amazon, you really have to put in like the title and the author or it doesn't come up. But you know, that's a good thing. So, and then the price is the same. You know, it's not any more from FGC Quaker Books. So just as good to support our organization.
Yeah, I would comment it's worth making a comment along with the stars, because at least on Amazon, people read those comments and it helps them make up their minds.
Yeah,
they do.
I think our star system is reconnected on quakerbooks.org. The bookstore for FGC is quakerbooks.org. And so we obviously have the book there. And I have some copies locally also. But anyway, yeah, I'll have to check out, see if our star system is working again.
Well, Lois, I see that we're kind of approaching the end of our time, yes?
Well, we really appreciated your being here, and you've told us good stories, and we've been glad to listen to you.
Well, if anybody has any last questions, I'm happy to answer them. I hope to be on a speaking tour after COVID, and maybe I'll get to see some of you in person. But think of me, and I'd love to be invited to come out and work with any of your groups, especially some of your high school age young people.
Barb, Tom Bowen had his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that your book put me so much in the atmosphere of the time of in 17th century England and the Lake District and Quaker and religious uprisings that it really gave me a tremendous thirst to learn more about the times and about the religious fervor that was going on and its interconnection with politics. I think the way you brought the atmosphere of the time in was just remarkable.
Oh, I love you. Thank you. How nice of you to say. I mean, I worked so hard on that book. And I want to underscore how all along the way in this country and in Great Britain, I was so supported by friends. So the hospitality or encouragement that you give somebody doing another project, I mean, you just don't know how important that is. And so I thank you, Tom. I mean, of course, I love hearing all that. But I also want to say it wouldn't have been done alone. God had a hand.
Are there any more comments or should I close the meeting?
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.